Okay, so welcome to the last session of the day, and we are right between this presentation, this session, and the reception, so let's cut to the chase. This will be perspective on environmental impacts and environmental justice. I am Marie-Jo Fremont, and my fellow co-chair, Debi Wagner, unfortunately could no longer be here today with us as she is sick, and she is attending remotely. However, Darlene Yapley, whom you have met multiple times, has graciously volunteered to help me out during the Q&A portion. So I'm excited. We have three speakers today who are going to provide different perspectives and share with us their knowledge and insights on environmental impacts and environmental justice. Our first speaker is a transportation scholar who teaches at the Knowlton School at Ohio State University, and she also holds a position with the Center of Aviation Studies. She's also a member of the Transportation Research Board of the National Academies. Please welcome Dr. Amber Woodburn McNair.
All right, hello, thank you for the introduction. My name is Amber Woodburn McNair, and I will be speaking with you today about environmental justice in airport planning practice. And as Mary-Jo mentioned, I currently work at the Ohio State University, where I teach airport planning, and I conduct airport planning research with a focus on equity planning and environmental justice. And I would like to share some thoughts with you. Let me see if I can get this to work. There we go. I would like to share some thoughts with you on what it means to me to be focused on equity planning and justice in transportation. So I want to consider these first two quotes that I have on the slides for you. So in an academic paper, Drs. Pereira, Schwanen, and Bannister wrote, "Justice can be understood as a broad moral and political ideal that relates to how benefits and burdens are distributed in society, the fairness of processes and procedures of decision and distribution, and the rights and entitlements which should be recognized and enforced." And then as part of her ethos for her firm called Thrivance Group, Dr. Destiny Thomas de Guzman writes that the key equity challenges facing the transportation planning sector can be summarized as components of complex and endemic interlocking systems of oppression, domination, and discrimination. It is imperative that transportation practitioners learn to address and redress the legacies of othering, ableism, homophobia, classism, slavery, anti-Indigenous ideals, and racism, in addition to the systemic and structural limitations created by those legacies. And Dr. de Guzman is currently a part of the USDOT's Advisory Committee on Transportation Equity. There are many ways that we can consider the link between the aviation industry and equity. And I have been working with undergraduate and graduate students on a variety of topics with funding from organizations like the Airport Cooperative Research Program, the FAA, and Honda. They're very active in Mid-Ohio. Some of my students' projects include evaluating equity and land use associated with vertiport infrastructure planning, evaluating airport development on tribal lands, evaluating arts administration strategies for locally inclusive art curation at airports, who are some of our largest sources of public art, studying approaches to ensure compatible land use near airports. And then notably later this year, hopefully by summer, myself along with my colleagues at HMMH and Thrivance Group will publish 2 publicly available reports funded by the Airport Cooperative Research Program. And these publications intend to improve a reader's knowledge of systemic racism within the United States and provides guidance on incorporating environmental justice and equity principles and data into airport organizational structures and everyday work. So the remainder of this presentation is going to focus on a paper that I published in 2020 in an academic journal called the Transportation Research Part D, Transport and the Environment. If anyone would like a copy of that, I'm happy to share that with you if you can't get access to it yourself. I was motivated to complete this work because the US airport system continues to expand in place. And in lieu of finding another way or place to grow, there is a need to explore the power structures that guide these decision-making processes. And specifically, I was curious about the wave of hub airport expansion projects that occurred after 2000. And my specific research question for this work asks, how did the Federal Aviation Administration and the airport owners frame and evaluate environmental justice in the NEPA planning process for airport planning expansion? And For those of you, I recognize you have mixed companies, so NEPA process being those that involve the environmental impact statements and records of decision. So if that's new to you, I don't have time to go into it in detail. I'd love to talk to you later though. So to be clear, this research is ultimately a commentary about airport planning practice. It is a review of existing planning documents and includes a counter-narrative critique of the metrics and methods used to measure environmental justice. Importantly, this research is not a compliance study. It is not a legal brief about NEPA or EISs, and it is not a historical review of federal guidelines or policies. It's a very narrow scope of research. So the methodological approach for this work includes the following general steps. First, I chose a sample of airports that expanded that I would review as part of my sample for the study. Then I ranked airports by what we call counter-narrative metrics. So these counter-narrative metrics included alternative means for measuring the need for an expansion and alternative means for measuring environmental justice concerns. Next, I collected and analyzed planning documents for my airport sample, and then finally I compared the findings from those planning documents to the findings that came from my counter-narrative metrics. So in terms of establishing that study sample, I ultimately included 19 airports. I started with the 66 largest that existed in the year 2000 and narrowed that down to those that had experienced significant new runway projects or other types of major expansion, maybe a runway extension or new terminals, and that had been planned or developed between 2000 and 2010. So this is an older set. You can see the list here. I ended up with 14 airports that had new runway projects and 5 airports that had other types of major expansions. The complete list, I don't have time to necessarily run through each and every one of them, but maybe you see one that you recognize. And if you want to read the paper, I go into more detail about each of those. So after finalizing the study sample, the next step was to perform a spatial demographic analysis to develop this counter-narrative metric for environmental justice impacts. I used a method that we call a location quotient to determine the concentration of different demographics in airport-adjacent communities relative to their metropolitan areas. I used demographics within 5 kilometers, about 3 miles, of the airport to better capture the long-term risk of a variety of impacts that can be realized as a result of that close proximity to the airport, as opposed to only focusing on those inside the forecasted noise contours. I further developed a risk of disproportionate impact score to provide a baseline understanding of the presence of protected social groups. So of the 19 airports, the 3 that you see on this slide here, Atlanta, Charlotte, and Phoenix, exhibited the greatest presence and concentration of protected social groups in their airport adjacent communities. So then the next step was to perform an operations analysis to develop a counter-narrative metric for understanding the airport operations needs and the airport's operational urgency to expand. So the conventional strategy is to forecast future aircraft operations and calculate delay. Instead, I measured the existing strain on the airfield's capacity in the year 2000, where capacity strain measures the number of hours that the airport utilized more than 85% of their airfield capacity during that year. So of the 19 airports, Chicago O'Hare, Boston Logan, and Atlanta Hartsfield Jackson each experienced the most hours of capacity strain in 2000. Then with those 2 metrics, I plotted them on the same chart. So here you can see on the y-axis there is capacity strain, on the x-axis there is risk of disproportionate impact, and each dot represents an airport within my sample. So the dots that are plotted towards the upper right both have high capacity strain and higher risks of disproportionate environmental justice impacts, for example, Atlanta, and then the dots on the lower left have low capacity strain and lower risks of disproportionate environmental justice impacts, for example, Fort Lauderdale. All right, so then after I generated my counter-narrative metrics, I transitioned to reviewing the actual NEPA documents themselves and looking inside for how the formal FAA narratives and airport sponsor narratives were constructed. So I wanted to see how environmental justice was measured and then ultimately interpreted. I specifically reviewed the environmental impact statements and the records of decision. So in an airport context, the EIS and ROD are key planning documents prepared specifically to evaluate and disclose environmental impacts of the airport development to the public. And so in this particular table, which I recognize you probably can't read if you're sitting in the room with us today, Essentially, each row is an airport in the sample, and then as we move through the columns, the gray columns record the year that the record of decision was published, so those ranged from as early as 1997 and as late as 2011. The green columns provide some detail about the methodological content described within the NEPA documents. So that methodological detail specifically includes things like what we call the comparison geography, the population groups of interest, and the impacts, the environmental impacts of interest. So in environmental justice analysis, the geographic area with the greatest adverse impact is then compared to some larger geographic group to determine if the distribution of impacts meets some measure of fairness. And so this comparison is then called the comparison geography. 9 airports in the sample selected that immediate project area in and around the airport as the comparison geography, while 5 airports went to a larger scale looking at county or metro area as a comparison geography. So then the types of impacts that you could I'll probably guess here are the most common ones that reach some level of significance were noise due to forecast operations and displacement due to land acquisition. And then the last bit of information I looked for through the yellow columns here was some details about the environmental justice conclusions and how they reported whether there was a significant environmental justice impact and if they ultimately decided to propose any mitigation strategies. All right, so that's kind of the work of what I did. So what did I find? In general, I have 3 findings I want to discuss and 3 points of significance. So the first major finding is that the methodological variation in the comparison geography prevented the FAA and the airport owners from addressing disparities. So arguably, in the context of environmental justice, it is appropriate to compare the geographic area whose environment or economy is degraded by the future airport activity, so typically our airport adjacent communities, comparing them to a geographic area whose environment or economy will gain from the future airport activity, for example, larger metro areas or regions. Yet the airport sample contained multiple examples where the impacts to a significant population of protected persons was downplayed simply because the immediate project area also contained a large population of protected people. So in effect, the near airport comparison geographies adopt a perspective that if the airfield harms predominantly Black households, no matter which way the airfield or the runway is oriented, then there is no disproportionate harm to Black households, and we can proceed. So that practice does not consider whether Black households are disproportionately concentrated in residential areas near the airport when compared to the larger region. So of the 3 airport projects where environmental justice impacts were detected in the NEPA analysis, all 3 of them did use the county as a comparison geography. So they did look larger, and that enabled them to actually detect these challenges. And those were Atlanta, LA, and Chicago. The second major finding is the tendency to null the finding of environmental justice impacts were detected. So even when disproportionate impacts were detected, there was a tendency to construct a narrative that nulled the finding. For example, only Atlanta Airport reported a finding of a net environmental justice impact, and 2 other airports, LA and Chicago, found an environmental justice impact initially, but then applied a mitigation narrative that nulled the significance of the impact. So the strength of the mitigation was unclear, right? So there was a very loose claim saying this mitigation strategy would have any effect on environmental justice. It was a very weakly supported claim. So good neighbor mitigation efforts may be beneficial, but it's not necessarily clear how those interventions are determined to be meaningful compensation or adequate reconciliation for consequences to individual health, to neighborhood livability, or household economic status. Nor is it clear the extent that federal agencies or local airport owners are legally required to follow through with any of those mitigation efforts that they outline. The narrative interpretation also occasionally referenced a requirement for the impact to be worse than the do-nothing scenario, which implies that airports are entitled to continue unjust distributions of impacts if those impacts are also expected in the no-build scenario. Third, the methodological variation was not consistently grounded in broader context-sensitive approaches. So my counter-narrative metric for capacity strain provided a singular rigid metric to assess capacity need at all airports in the sample. In reality, the NEPA process grants flexibility for the FAA and facility owners to choose metrics and craft a narrative justification that clarifies the purpose and need for airport expansion. So while all 19 airports in this sample demonstrated a sufficient need according to the NEPA process, only 8 of the 19 demonstrated a sufficient need according to my counter-narrative metric proposed in the study. However, the rigidity of my proposed counter-narrative metric diminished the complexity of the airport's arguable need to expand and meet forecast demand. So by imposing rigidity on the airport's need rather than the way we measure the community's need, I highlight the value of context-sensitive metrics. So if you thought my metric was not specific enough or context-sensitive enough, I would agree with you, and I would assert that we need to also apply that logical thinking of how we grant flexibility to the way we measure communities. We need to give them that same context-sensitive analysis. All right, so the significance of the study and my findings are that the social costs of collective airport expansion in this particular sample remained unclear and very likely was underestimated in the NEPA process. Second, using the do-nothing scenario as an interpretive benchmark is antithetical to reparative and restorative justice approaches. It permits unjust solutions if they are not quite as unjust as the do-nothing scenario. And then last, the metrics and methods used in environmental justice assessment should have their own narrative justifications and explanations. So EJ assessment requires flexibility and context-sensitive strategies that capture the social histories of a place, with opportunities for communities to provide input on how they are measured and summarized. Metrics can certainly be an aid to help us tell a comprehensive story about the lived experiences in an airport-adjacent community, but rigid, standardized numerical methods do not reveal the social and historical contexts that are central to the principles of environmental justice and equity planning. At worst, these rigid metrics can be used to downplay the very existence of environmental justice concerns, and ultimately this contributes to expansion-centric narratives that are more likely to perpetuate spatial patterns of advantage and disadvantage rather than rectify them. Thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to answer questions later.
Our next speaker is a senior advisor in the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights of the Environmental Protection Agency, where she provides leadership and collaborative action for integrating environmental justice and equity considerations throughout EPA's programmatic activities. Across her over 25 years with EPA, she has provided strategic direction for research and policy matters at the nexus of environmental justice, equitable community engagement, and the transportation sector. She also played a key planning role in the EPA Environmental Justice and Systemic Racism Speaker Series. Today, she'll lead us through an environmental justice journey as it relates to aviation. Please welcome Sabrina Johnson.
Good afternoon. Thank you. It's a pleasure being here. One note, a late breaking change. My colleague Tai Lung will not be able to join us. However, another colleague, Zaida Figueroa, will be his stand-in, and she'll be participating virtually. And she will handle our EJ screen overview. I'm not sure if she'll be able to do the live demo or not. Zaida is the director of our policy analysis division within the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights at EPA. Okay. So I'm going to move pretty quickly because we don't have a lot of time, but please note that in the appendix of the slide deck, I do have a lot of additional detail on all of the topics we'll be noting. So I'll start with a statement about environmental quality data and where things are with that. A little bit about EPA and the aviation regulatory landscape. Talk some more about environmental justice and equity and some activities that are going on both in the federal sector and others, and then talk about data visualization and mapping and the opportunities that we have featuring EPA's EJ screen, and wrap up with a few comments about what I see on the horizon. And again, the appendix provides much more detail. Regarding the state of science, we have a lot of extensive research available on many topics related to environmental quality associated with aviation activities. We know a lot about the air, water, climate impacts, et cetera, the sources of pollution, those pollutants and what happens to them, modeling and measurement techniques also. So we have the foundational knowledge to address environmental challenges associated with aviation. I'm sure many in this audience are familiar with ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, which conducts aircraft engine emissions standard setting. The U.S. delegation to ICAO is led by FAA, and EPA acts in an advisory role, especially on working groups, particularly the Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection. Wanted to say a little bit about leaded fuel. As was mentioned earlier this morning, EPA published our endangerment finding in October of 2023 concerning lead air pollution. And that action will lead to some subsequent regulatory action on the part of both FAA and EPA, who collaborated and were in coordination on that endangerment finding. Environmental justice and equity. This administration has focused unprecedented priority attention on environmental justice and equity through numerous executive orders that emphasize a whole of government approach accompanied with historic levels of funding through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Wanted to mention a little bit about EPA's history in this space. It goes back to 1992 when EPA established the Office of Environmental Equity, which then quickly became the Office of Environmental Justice, and now is a full-fledged national program office with the same standing as the major media offices, such as the Office of Air and Office of Water, et cetera. We have combined the Office of Environmental Justice, the Office of External Civil Rights, and the Conflict Prevention and Resolution Office into one. And we continue principal involvement in a number of federal actions. The National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, we're involved also with the White House Environmental Justice Action Advisory Council, and the Council on Environmental Quality's Interagency Council. I wanted to also mention some activities around equity and environmental justice that have been prompted by the transportation sector. So the Transportation Research Board, which is an arm of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, published a racial equity addendum to their biennial Critical Issues in Transportation publication in 2021. And in this addendum, they acknowledged the historical legacy of governmental decisions that have adversely impacted marginalized communities and have an impact even today. The Airport Cooperative Research Program, ACRP, sponsored an event, an insight event, where they convened a whole host of stakeholders interested in aviation activities to address systemic inequality in the airport sector. And also there's an ACRP research project underway now integrating and incorporating environmental justice and equity data and principles into airport decision-making processes. EPA's Office of Transportation and Air Quality has undertaken a demographic analysis for near airport locations, and in 2020 published the national analysis of the populations residing near or attending school near U.S. airports. The peer-reviewed report is available at the link shown there. And the analysis is undergoing update and expansion right now to answer some specific questions about demographics of those in close proximity. Wanted to talk a bit about data visualization and mapping, because we have in the evolving data science arena great opportunities to equip and empower communities to enhance analysis that can accompany regulatory actions and really advance the capacity of the aviation sector and other stakeholders to improve quality of life conditions throughout the country through these powerhouse tools. And so EPA has developed, of course, EJ Screen, but a number of other federal organizations have developed their own, and I list them there, and you can reference those through those links as well. Everyone from the Department of Energy and Department of Transportation, CDC, and NOAA. In addition, a significant number of states have developed their own mapping tools. And further, local mapping tools have been developed by several local jurisdictions. And so at this point, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Zaida, who will talk about EJ Screen, our environmental justice screening and mapping tool, and give us some context for its utility in this arena.
Thank you, Sabrina, so much for that amazing collection of statements and information for everyone. I just wanted to make sure that we touch on EJ Screen, and EJ Screen is the starting point for the EPA when considering environmental justice. It's a very powerful tool. We actually collaborate with many of the other tool developers out there that Sabrina just mentioned, including CGIST. And EJ Screen is EPA's web-based GIS tool that was designed to provide nationally consistent information on environmental justice. And I just have to emphasize that national consistency. It allows EPA and other users and other partners to really start asking questions about environmental justice. So it's not a risk assessment tool, it's not a regulatory or decision-making tool, rather a screening look of where these communities are and what are some of the factors that needs to be accounted for as these communities are being evaluated. So EJ Screen has a key features in terms of its functionality. EJ Screen is set apart from other tools because we have, the tool itself contains EJ and also supplemental indices. So many of those indices includes a combination of demographic indicators, and there is something very unique about EJ Screen. There are about 13 corresponding EJ indices and 13 corresponding supplemental indices. I just wanted to point it out that for EJ Screen, one of the most important things, again, is the socioeconomic indicators that we have. We continue to expand the health and climate and other indicators annually. So EJ Screen have a cyclic rotation of updates with a new one coming up in 2024, late spring, early summer, May, June timeframe. And again, our goal is to continue to expand the indicators, multiple indicators at all levels to inform, again, that screening view for the different communities. EJ Screen uses census data. So as you all know, as the census get updated, EJ Screen also is updated, and we have a resolution at the block level, which is very important because some of our users always ask us why you're not including this information or why you're not including some of my data sets. And the answer is we always have to look into the resolution of the tool, and the tool have new capabilities to actually include users' data sets. So that's one of the newest additions to EJ Screen, where the user could upload their own information to some extent. The climate indicators are very important, and today unfortunately, we're not going to have a live demonstration, but I just want to point out a few things. The first one is that we have EJ Screen public office hours, and that is our way to engage with the community and also to engage with all our users. We also have the EJ Screen help desk, and Sabrina could follow up with this information and share with all the participants of this conference. We also have individualized training opportunities as requested. We can set up a time with subject matter experts, and Tai Long, unfortunately could not be here with us today, but provide that individualized training and really dive into the topics of questions and needs, etc. We also have an upcoming EJ Screen in NEPA, which I do think is very pertinent for this group, and it could also inform some of your activities. So I just wanted to raise that up because that's a latest edition that just started in January.
Okay, thank you so much, Zaida. We appreciate your participation virtually and at the last minute. So I'll wrap up with a couple of issues I think we should consider on the horizon. Advanced air mobility and infrastructure, and what does that mean in the context of environmental justice and community engagement, et cetera. With unmanned aerial vehicles and systems, vertiports, electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, moving into not only airports, but the center city space. What are the implications of that for airports and for communities? And I think that in part the answer is that there will be more effort to engage with the public, with communities, and with people who are impacted by way of proximity, more emphasis on public health and safety and environmental quality, and promoting environmental justice and equity. And so we have great opportunities and tools and challenges as the technology pushes us in that direction to really convene and do a lot of engagement on what we can do to improve quality of life for communities throughout the country. With that, I thank you.
So thank you, Sabrina. So our final speaker is a familiar face to this conference, and he doesn't need further introduction. So please welcome Don Scata from the Office of Environment and Energy of the FAA.
All right, hello again, everyone. As I start, I wanted to acknowledge and thank my colleague, Michon Washington, who is joining us, I hope, remotely. She's the true expert in environmental justice and prepared this presentation that I'll be giving. I'm standing in because I'd already agreed to come and talk with you about the panel earlier today with Darlene before we were asked to participate in this panel, in this conversation as well. So worked out that I was here, I could give the presentation. Michon will be available to answer questions. Again, hopefully she's on, and thank you, Michon. So the FAA complies with the environmental justice requirements under the umbrella of the National Environmental Policy Act, including Executive Order 12898, 14096, and all of the other federal requirements you've heard about today. In addition, we follow our 2021 Department of Transportation Order 5610.2C, which provides environmental justice procedures for DOT modal administrations in response to the 2011 Memorandum of Understanding on Environmental Justice signed by the heads of federal agencies, DOT's 2016 Environmental Justice Strategy, and Executive Order 12898, DOT's EJ Strategic Plan, is currently in the process of being updated in accordance with EO 14096. The FAA also provides FAA-specific guidance on our NEPA implementing order, FAA Order 1050.1F, and Chapter 12 of the 1050.1F desk reference, which will be discussed in a future slide. So looking at NEPA analysis tools, we just heard about EJ Screen, and at the FAA, we do use EJ Screen for some elements of our environmental justice analyses, including demographic information and for combining environmental and demographic indicators into EJ indices. However, EJ Screen defines low income as individuals living with incomes below 200% of the federal poverty level, which differs from the Department of Transportation definition included in DOT Order 5610.2C, which we use at FAA. As a result, when using EJ Screen, FAA practitioners must convert the low income results so that they can be compared to the DOT definition. We also use our Aviation environmental design tool to help with the conversion process. FAA practitioners often use ADT. ADT is a software system that models aircraft performance in space and time to estimate fuel consumption, emissions, noise, and air quality consequences. ADT is a comprehensive tool that provides information to stakeholders on each of the specific environmental impacts. And there's an EJ model within the software. And you can find anything you might want to know about ADT at adt.fa.gov. ADT contains a module to screen for potential environmental justice populations and identify populations of limited English proficiency. The tool helps us to identify potential environmental justice and limited English proficient populations to assist community outreach efforts associated with FAA actions subject to NEPA. There's also a guidance document that provides information on how to use the capability to satisfy the requirements of NEPA in accordance with FAA Order 1050.1F. So as a result of the emphasis that this administration has placed on environmental justice issues, several work groups have been established at various levels of the executive branch. We currently participate in the following work groups. There's an interagency advisory council. So the old EJ interagency working group, as part of President Biden's historic commitment to environmental justice, he created the White House Environmental Justice Interagency Council when he signed Executive Order 14008, just days after taking office. That order charges the IAC with developing a strategy to address current and historic environmental injustice by consulting with the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council and with local environmental justice leaders. It further requires the IAC to develop clear performance metrics to ensure accountability and publish an annual public performance scorecard on its implementation. The NEPA committee has been tasked with revising and updating the 2016 promising practices for EJ methodologies in NEPA review and is awaiting further instruction from CEQ concerning those revisions. The 2016 guidance document was produced by the EJ IWG and is a compilation of methodologies gleaned from actual agency practices identified by the NEPA committee concerning the interface of EJ considerations throughout the NEPA process. The DOT EJ Working Group. This is a working group that's focused on promoting best practices for EJ analyses throughout the Department of Transportation, including the development of a DOT EJ strategic plan. FAA is currently updating our NEPA order, FAA Order 1050.1F, to reflect the June 2023 amendments to the NEPA statute and the revisions to CEQ's NEPA implementing regulations. The desk reference, regarding the desk reference, today we've added a significant level of detail on the various methodologies used to evaluate and analyze potential environmental impacts to communities with environmental justice concerns. The release of EO 14096 will require further revision upon implementation guidance from CEQ. The Promising Practices document was discussed in the previous slide, and FAA is a member of the NEPA committee charged with those revisions. And that's all I have for you today. Here's Michon's contact information, and I think we are now transitioning to Q&A. Thank you.
First question is to Sabrina. Does EPA's EJ commitment include funding for airports to further their own EJ commitments?
Is this on? No, we would not directly fund airports per se, if that was the question.
Yeah, does that include funding airports to help their EJ efforts?
No, not direct funding to another to airport agencies.
Okay, thank you. Amber, what are the top 3 things that need to change to improve the quality of EJ analysis?
Hi, thanks for that question. I also want to caveat this with you're getting reflections from my review of documents published a while ago. So big caveat there. I would say one of the biggest things that could have been done to improve the set I looked at is changing the discourse around the comparison geography. Simply comparing what was referred to as the airport environs, so like that, again, that like really immediate close area in and around an airport, is rooted in the idea that an airport can only control how they might orient their airfield. So from the airport's perspective of what can I control, they didn't want to be held responsible for comparing in other parts of the region, right? They couldn't just plop a new airport somewhere else, so why would I look somewhere else? So if it was done from the perspective of just what the airport feels like it can control, it's more of an airport-centric view. But if it's from the perspective of what are the principles of environmental justice, how do we practice that in our methodology, it is more appropriate to try to understand how legacies of redlining and segregation and housing development has, concentrated people into certain areas of the cityscape. So I would say that to me, that was a number one thing that they could have done. Second thing would have been much more discussion about how communities were engaged to think about how they were measured, like how was poverty and low income status defined. Those were not necessarily consistent, even in the subset that I had looked at. And I don't know, it wasn't a policy analysis. I didn't interview the FAA to ask, why did they look this way? I was looking at what, as a member of the public, do I have access to? So there were ways that having more community feedback as part of the methodology for describing communities seemed like it would have been an important thing to practice. So those would probably be my top 2 just from the set that I looked at. And I guess the third part for me would have been not making EJ just something we investigate in the NEPA process. So the NEPA process as a planning activity is not the only place we can look at how communities are impacted or how environmental justice should be affecting our decision-making and our planning. So even thinking bigger picture about EJ well outside of the NEPA process, I think is maybe my third off the top of my head. Thank you.
Thanks. Dawn, what emissions metrics does the FAA consider in environmental reviews, and in particular EJ analyses?
Michon, are you here? I can answer the emission question. I know we look at local air quality, those impacts specifically, but, Michon, are you available? No, she's not on? Okay, so I'm gonna have to, whoever asked that question, feel free to come up afterwards, and I can take your contact information. We'll get you an answer. Thanks.
Thank you. Sabrina, the mission of the EPA is to protect health and environment. Please describe how the EPA plans to address fine particulate matter and noise.
Okay, well, I'll say first on noise. The EPA hasn't done a whole lot on noise because I think it was 1981 or so, was the last time that we received appropriated funds to do so. So noise remains largely the purview of FAA. Well, our standard approach for updating our NACs, our National Air Quality Planning and Standards, National Ambient Air Quality Standards, excuse me. We on a routine basis that is required by the statute. We review technology and review what is necessary to tighten regulations on a periodic basis. And I'm not sure what the scheduling would be to examine whether or not fine particulate matter would be considered. So I'm not sure about that.
Dawn, does the FAA consider all air traffic, helicopter, et cetera, over communities when doing environmental reviews?
I think it would, the answer to that question would sort of depend on what the federal action is that we are evaluating. If it's related information, then absolutely, but if it's, you know, a surface project at an airport that doesn't really have anything to do with airspace, then we wouldn't necessarily need to consider those sorts of things. So it's very context is sort of the way to answer or look at that question.
Amber, you talked about looking at the NEPA documents, et cetera. Do you have any specific recommendations in the NEPA process to better represent EJ?
So recommendations specifically for the NEPA process. So I think this has to do a little bit with, so I have done some other work looking at NEPA that has to do with how we're scoping the purpose and need and how that purpose and need ultimately shapes sort of the standing of different types of impacts and then ultimately the standing of different types of communities. And so one of the things that I had done in this particular research that I presented was to not necessarily just look at environmental justice as the secondary step after a significant impact is found, right? So usually it would be noise is significant, you draw the noise contour, and then you figure out if the noise impact has an environmental justice significance threshold that you have reached. I would like to see environmental justice treated as something that is more about understanding airport adjacent communities and the long-term potential effects that are more cumulative and compounding. So it's noise on top of emissions, on top of the risk of like PFAS coming out of the firefighting chemicals. Like there's many different layers of types of effects that compound on top of each other that maybe when evaluated one at a time don't seem to meet a significance threshold. But when you look at collectively what is happening in a community and how it's compounding on existing issues like low access to medical care or challenges with their school district, there's a lot more happening in a community than just 1.5 or 3 decibel increase in noise that airport is perhaps quote responsible for. It's compounding on top of lots of other things. And so if environmental justice is strictly a checklist item that comes after significance of something else, I think we're really not practicing the spirit of what environmental justice and equity planning has to offer in the NEPA process. But that's something that is not an easy thing to resolve without giving the FAA and USDOT some different legislation to respond to. And NEPA is a collection of legislation that we are responding to at this point. So outside the NEPA process seems like a better strategy in my view.
Sabrina, this might be related to the previous question, but it's more specific. Does the EPA provide technical assistance grants to communities for community-based efforts when they face an airport project that triggers a NEPA review?
I would say that there are a number of our technical assistance and grant programs that would support communities who are facing challenges related to various transportation sector activities. Not necessarily specifically one targeting NEPA review actions, but our technical assistance grants, collaborative problem-solving grants, et cetera, may be available for supporting those kinds of efforts that communities might be facing. And I think if you go to epa.gov/environmental justice, you can then look at our grants and technical assistance web presence for a description of all of those funding opportunities.
Okay, Dawn, I learned about the compliance of the FAA. Oops, it just jumped. I learned about the compliance of the FAA with orders and documents as well as FAA activities. Can you provide some perspectives on the FAA and EJ?
So that's a pretty open-ended question. I think the way that I can answer it is we've always seen this as an important topic to consider during our environmental reviews, and have welcomed the additional priority that we've seen from the current administration on the topic, and have been actively working among all of those work groups that I mentioned to improve how we consider environmental justice impacts, or impacts to environmental justice communities in our environmental review. So, I think to simply answer it, it's an important thing that we're considering. We're trying to do better, learn from how we've done it in the past, and learn how others consider those impacts, and improve the way we do our analysis.
I'm not tall enough to notice that there was a hand raised by Zaida. So Zaida, please go ahead and speak.
Yeah, so thank you so much. This has been a great section. I just wanted to point it out regarding the previous questions on particulate matter, that fairly recent, a few weeks ago, the EPA issued a final rule reconsideration of PM. So I definitely I don't want to misspoke about everything that the rule contains, but it's fairly recent, and it's going to be revising some of the air quality indexes and to improve, public communications, but also other areas related to PM and as part of the NACs. So just wanted to point that out, that documentation is available now on the EPA website, and it was released fairly recent.
Sabrina, should EPA be relying on regional monitoring for Airport Clean Air Act compliance when often these air monitors are located far away from airports, even though they're impacted?
Placement of air quality monitors, that is a challenge in many geographic locations. And we're working on a number of approaches to involve communities in decisions about appropriate placement to the sources that they know are causing problems, and different kinds of monitors. The sort of standard monitors that would allow us to make regulatory decisions, that's one type of network. There are mobile monitors, and there are personal monitors also that are accessible to community stakeholders. But we are working to fine-tune and align placement of monitors so that we can more accurately discern what emission sources are emanating, what sources are emanating emissions, and what we can do to reduce those impacts.
Amber, it's quite unique to have a researcher specifically talking about NEPA, specifically looking at airports, crawling through the documents. Are you aware of any other efforts that are that kind of relevant to airplanes, airports, et cetera, in the EJ space? I think you are working on a National Academies effort, right?
Yeah, so in terms of actually reviewing NEPA documents and looking at environmental justice, just generally for airports, there are very few academic studies focused on environmental justice in airports. And when they are published, usually they are by folks who are emissions modelers, and they're doing kind of like a one-off study that happens to focus on airport infrastructure. They're not like airport first folks. And there's surprisingly very little kind of like non-legal research about NEPA in general. Like there's some good books I could recommend to people if you email me that you could read about NEPA in general, but NEPA is really understudied academically. And even in the academic circles, I do have folks who know about NEPA tend to be kind of dismissive of its capacity to affect change, that it tends to be a very kind of pro-growth. We know what we want to do, and we're gonna just disclose to you that we're gonna do it, rather than take in some meaningful feedback from the communities affected by EIS's in and outside of airports. So yeah, I don't have a good person to refer you to for additional NEPA airport work in the academic space, sorry.
Or anything, it doesn't have to be NEPA, it could be just the EJ in the airport space, but.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's a urban historian who focuses on aviation. So
We'll get the
yeah,
name for next year.
Janet Bednarik has some good books about history, but she's not EJ. There's not really many of us, folks. Sorry.
We're thrilled to have you. Sabrina, are you aware of the proposed federal legislation called the Quiet Communities Act to fund the EPA's Office of Noise Abatement and Control? There is the existing EPA's Office of Noise Abatement and Control, but since Ronald Reagan, it's never been funded. So could you comment on that?
I believe over the years, there have been efforts to move that legislation along. So, yeah, but thank you for making us aware of that for the caller or the questioner.
Yes, yes. Caller number 2. In a very positive way, I'm curious, Amber, is there any airport or airports that you would like to identify that you felt had a best practice related to EJ?
This would be, I would say I can't speak in too much detail, but there is, like you had mentioned, the report that's coming out later this summer. We had done a bunch of case studies, and some of the case studies were not necessarily exclusively focused, like I said, on NEPA or anything, but just environmental justice in general. And what we had observed at the Port of Seattle, and not necessarily for an aviation example, but for a soil remediation project, really stood out to us as a particularly good approach to environmental justice, and many decades effort of learning how to listen to the community and really changing the internal structure of community engagement throughout the port in response to this soil remediation project. So that would be a case study I'd point people to learn from. And then we have some other examples that go into equity and environmental justice outside of noise and emissions that I would encourage folks to look at, because we're really just kind of, I think, at the beginning stages of good practice and good best practice to pay attention to in aviation. And that means we have to be able to look at things that aren't in our first field of noise or emissions. If that's our intellectual home, we might have to look and draw from other types of transportation facilities or other types of impacts in order to translate that into our own discipline. So hopefully you'll be able to engage with that, like I said, this summer, and learn something.
Thank you. Did Zaida have her hand up again? Or she? Yeah, oh, okay. What have you? Well, that concludes our questions. So thank you again to our panelists and the engaged audience. Thank you. We're going to have some final comments for the day, and so I'll bring up Justin.
All right, please join me in thanking all our moderators and speakers today. I think it was a really great day. I would like to invite Stephen Tabor. He's with Leach Tishman, one of our sponsors, to come up and say a few words before our welcome reception, which is right upstairs. So, Stephen.
Hi, thank you. This is the ad portion of the symposium. My name is Stephen Tabor. I'm a partner with Leach Tishman. I'm located in Pasadena, California, although the firm itself is Pittsburgh-based. I'm the leader of the Aviation and Aerospace Industry Practice Group, and also the co-leader of the Environmental Law Group at Leach Tishman. I got into this area as an attorney for the FAA back in the 90s and early aughts. And I continued that. There I learned all about, 1051E. I assisted in drafting 1051E, now it's 1F, and also 5054B, I think it was, that I helped drive when I was at the FAA. And now I saw the light and went to the other side. And in private practice, I handle a lot of regulatory administrative actions with the FAA usually on the other side. Although there are a lot of times when the FAA is assisting where I'm asking for assistance from the FAA with respect to certain clients. That's about it in terms of what we do at Leach Tishman. We represent, my practice now is focused a lot on aviation noise and emissions, representing municipalities and community action groups and special interests, as well as some airports, pilots, other people involved in the aviation community. With that, everyone is welcome to go to the reception. It's in the Fillmore room, right where we had lunch, and that's it for the first day of the symposium. Thank you very much.
And real quick, the planning committee just wanted to say that although we will not have the Walt Gilfin Award this year, it will be returning next year in 2025. So typically we would award it at this reception, but it will return next year. So hopefully you join us for our reception, and thank you. See you tomorrow.